Welcome, everyone, to this conversation called The Great Remembering. This conversation is being guided by the connections between culture and agriculture, demystifying the role and work of farmers, land stewards, seed, and keepers. We're exploring what it means to be truly regenerative and sustainable in our bodies, minds, and work. I am here with some really beautiful comrades that I have known most of you for at least the last decade, if not more. And I'm going to let them do their own introductions. But my name is Javon Sage. I am based in Savannah, Georgia. I am the work that I've done has been at the intersections of agriculture and food, of finding that connection between joy as well as justice within my work. As a food alchemist and as a birth worker, this is the work that is so close to my heart and has been for over the last decade. And I'm also now going to actually hand it off to Mama Karen to kick us off with introductions.
Hi, everybody. My name is Karen Washington. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and Mama K, so I'm Mama K. Right now, I'm in Gwinnett County, Georgia, the land of Cherokee and Creek people. But I do farm up in Chester, New York, the land of Lenape people. So my work is around food and social justice. I'm a farmer, an advocate, and an agitator. That's true to my work, and that's what I like to do. And I can pass it off to Jim.
Yes, good morning, and what a blessing to be here with Mama Kay and Sister Lee and Sister Javon. I enjoy beginning an intro by saying that I am stardust condensed in human form, and I represent the billions of years of Earth's evolution. And that was kind of brought to me by this great book, Racing the Cosmos, by Barbara Holmes. I'm calling in from our small family farm, which sits at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It's bathed by the Kentucky River watershed and is also nourished by the mineralized soil, mineralized by limestone rock. This land was occupied, for 20,000 years or so by the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Yuchi peoples before they were removed to Oklahoma in the Trail of Tears. My folks came here to Madison County as enslaved people around 1800, and the farm I occupy now is nearby where we were enslaved. I call myself the fourth generation of agrarian intellectual activist, and my work is to try each day to contribute to put one foot forward and can keep the work going that my ancestors laid before me.
Peace, family. My name is Leah Penniman. My pronouns are Lee, Eye, she, and Ya. I am the daughter of Reverend Dr. Adele Smith Penniman and Keith Penniman, and the granddaughter of Brownlee McCullough, Samuel, Cornelia Smith, Merton Penniman, and Claire Penniman. My heritage is Black. I'm both Haitian and Black American South, Indigenous Taino, and French. And I am here in this home that my family built with our hands from the clay, the mud, the straw, and the pine of this sacred land. This is Mohican territory, also the crossroads of Haudenosaunee territory, which we take very seriously in terms of what solidarity and accountability means. I am one of the co-founders and also the farm manager of Soulfire Farm, a Black, Indigenous, and people of color led food and land sovereignty project on this mountainside. And we are dedicated to uprooting racism and seeding sovereignty for our people. It is a deep honor to be here with all of you having this sacred conversation.
Well, thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. And I think I'm going to go with a softball question, which is, how do you envision us building regenerative, resilient communities? And what does it mean to you to bridge culture and agriculture?
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, for me, in this time, in this crisis of COVID, in which we're not going to go backwards, this new iteration of what community looks like has to have the faces and power of people who have been so long been marginalized. When we take a look at agriculture, I think we have lost our way because for me, the word culture has been missing. For so long, we have seen a industrial food system that has been built on racism, that has been built on monocropping, that has gone away from what culture should be in terms of diversity, has now become more profit bearing and more incentivizing in terms of profits versus people. And so for all of us at this point in time, I really want people to understand when we talk about agriculture to get back to the culture, ethnicities of so many people, the diversity that is needed in doing this work. So I'll stop there and have others chime in.
I would add a thought that as we envision this notion of building regenerative and resilient communities, where I live now was post the Civil War, essentially a rural Black community. The house I live in now sits right across the street. I can see it out of my window of the Black church that our families built and would go to and be baptized on the pond on our farm. Down the street from my house was the all-Black school that my great-grandparents and parents went to. And they built a resilient and regenerative community. So part of our work is to this kind of remembering and embracing this historical legacy of peoples who built communities post the Civil War. But I think our work is at least three levels. Part of our work has to be this holding ground, protesting, demonstrating, raising hell, doing the good trouble work that Lewis talked about, holding ground in the space we're in from the onslaught that's occurring every day. Second level of work has to be this idea of creating alternatives, creating these transition elements as we move ourselves from this 500 years of the industrial mindset and this homocentric view of the world to one that is more ecocentric and earth-centric. Third level of work has to be this work of vision, creating a vision that might project out 50 to 100 years, along with strategic plans that might be 5-year increments that guide us in that kind of a vision work. So 3 levels of work, again, holding ground, creating alternatives, and having vision. So I think that idea of culture and agriculture, we recognize that as we remember some 10,000, 12,000 years ago, it was women who developed what we tend to call the production of food and agriculture. At that point, there was a leap in human development. Modern human culture is based upon agriculture. We're at a point now where we're still suffering from the injustices of our country's founding, which was founded upon this seizure of land for agriculture, the enslavement of peoples to grow and produce agricultural products. And so we're still dealing with those kind of contradictions. So agriculture can serve, in my view, as a pivot, as a fulcrum for this paradigm shift, this next leap in human development. So agriculture represents how we as a human species evolve to the next level of our maturity.
Ashe. I want to build on what my elders are saying, especially this remembering piece, because I think that a part of culture that sometimes get obscured is the relationship to ecology and to the earth, which is, you know, as Black people, we have a thousands of year heritage of ecological humility that may have been obscured by the land-based oppression of the past couple hundred years, but is not forgotten. And I think this is really exemplified by the way that my teachers who are the Queen Mothers in Ghana, West Africa, where I studied farming and studied spiritual development, just admonished us saying, is it true that in the US, y'all put a seed in the ground? You don't pray, you don't dance, you don't pour libation, you don't ask permission, you don't sing, you don't even say thank you. And then you expect it to come up, give you this harvest, sustain your community. That's why you're all sick. You're all sick. And I think that the earth, honestly, has put us in a big sacred timeout in 2020 to think about what we did and reflecting upon human arrogance, reflecting upon the fact that I believe that our rightful place is as the younger siblings in creation, that the trees, the rocks, the soil, those are our older siblings, those are our elders. That's where we need to be looking to for wisdom, is part of our cultural heritage as Black people, not only Black people, Indigenous people around the world, but that part of this regenerative reclamation does have to do with ecological humility. And I think part of that, as you said, Jim, relates to time scale, is that, even in our progressive spaces, we still can adopt this capitalist time scale that we're looking for returns on a quarterly basis. What did you do by March? What did you do by the end of the year? But we need to be shifting to a generational time scale for the type of change we wish to see. And there's a beautiful image when we talk about, what does it look like to actually implement. There's this image of the butterfly of social transformation that we talk about a lot. And, butterflies by and large have 4 winglets, and a butterfly can't fly without all 4. And so if you think about our movement spaces as having these 4 wings of, as you said, Jim, resistance. So that has to do with the litigation, the boycotts, the hunger strikes, right? Reform, that's the folks who have the tenacity to kind of go into the belly of the beast and do the legislation work, the working with the media, the petitions kind of within the system. We have the builders, which is many of us, the people who create alternative institutions that represent the worlds we want to see, whether that's our freedom schools, our land trusts, our farms. But the healers, that's the 4th wing, is the healers, because there's no way that we can make it through like hundreds of years of land-based oppression and not come out really scarred and often inflicting lateral violence against the people who've experienced similar harms. And so there is some deep trauma healing that we need to be doing through ritual, through therapy, through story circles, through transformative justice, just so that we can get the other wings to be flapping and moving us forward. So yeah, ecological humility and the butterfly, that's what I have to say.
I love that analogy, because that's actually one of the things that I wanted to bring up, was this idea of healing. And, as the resident herbalist and, and the person who works in that space of healing, both on the spiritual, mental, and physical level, is like understanding, what does it take for us to really transform how we see healing, not as like, this kind of like end goal, like, we're going to get here at some point and we'll be healed and then great, we can go back to what we were doing before. But like that there's this constant facing ourselves, the same way you would prepare the soil for planting a seed. It's like, how do we prepare our spirits? How do we prepare our minds and our bodies to continue to do the work that guides us, and the necessary work that has to happen as land keepers, as seed keepers, and how do we continue to do that in a way that is people centered? Because I think we have these conversations around what the work looks like, whether you're in a nonprofit or for-profit, that in so many ways, that those systems continue to replicate harm. For the folks who are in those systems, and I say that as a former like community organizer, like that so much of my work was still driven in the same pace of capitalistic extraction. Like, how can we get as many votes? How can we get as many phone bankers? How can we, because we really want to create this change, but somehow we were still embodying that same thing. And I think I see this happening in agriculture, that same kind of drive to produce, to overproduce, to extract. And we do that for people, we do that for the land. And so how can we really create a space to where we can hold one another, to where we can hold our work and really do it in a way that is feeding us, and yeah, of course, feeding the people, but like feeding us as workers as well. And so that's always something that I love, that we're part of that fourth wing is the healers. And so for folks who are, because I think you started touching on this, Leah, a bit, is like, the principles that are guiding your work. What are the principles that guide each of your work, and did you have to discover or unearth them along the way, or are there things that just kind of hold true based on your own upbringing and your familial practices?
Well, for me, what guides me are a variety of principles that can be summarized with this idea of operating every day with what I call the goodness to all concerned, as well as this sense of sacred regard for all our relations, whether it's the human people, whether it's the plant, animal, rock, air, fire people. They're all our relations, and to have this remembrance of those kinds of sacred relationships. We talk about dirt, soil, earth. That's that divine medium that we're all made from, that all becomes us. The movie called Dirt the Movie that Wangari Maathai is featured in is a good example of how we need to recognize that how we heal the soil, as George Washington Carver talked about, if we injure the soil, then we injure the people, and vice versa, and they're all interconnected. So healing comes from there. But also, I would say that my principles come from the life and works of Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, that talks about lifting as we climb. The work of Mahatma Gandhi and Carver talked about be the change you seek in the world. But also I'm guided by the principles in the songs, reach out and touch somebody's hand, make this world a better place if you can. Or the songs, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, this little light of mine. But lastly, I'm guided by like great poets and poetesses who have laid the way. Remember, Langston Hughes said, we the people must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain, and make America again. Those things guide my work.
That's beautiful.
I guess for me, the principle has always been and continues to be self-discovery and a sense of belonging. I mean, I did not grow up in a farming background. So parents weren't farmers. Grandparents weren't farmers. So I came out of this back in the 60s. I'm 66 years of age. And it was a point in time growing up that farming was never mentioned. My relationship to food at growing up was that, my mom was a good cook and the food came from a grocery store. So I didn't have that connection of my value, of my heritage in terms of farming. I would go to conferences and workshops and be in the middle of a group of thousands of people and hearing the reference around farming and agriculture that was white-led. I could count on my hands how many people looked like me. I could see the instructors and people who were talking who were white but never referenced my people's involvement in agriculture. And so it wasn't until I was in my late 50s that I really understood exactly the participation of my heritage in agriculture. Growing up in school was never mentioned. Our reference around Black people was always around slavery and then around the civil rights movement. But it was never about the intention on why we were brought here, our contribution to agriculture. And so when I found that self-discovery of the fact that it wasn't a slave mentality that my people were brought into in terms of agriculture, it was an attitude of power. The fact that we were brought here with seeds in our hair, that we were brought here with our with our knowledge of agriculture was a whole different discovery for me, because back in the day, that wasn't even mentioned. And so at 66 years of age, finding that self-discovery, but also finding that sense of belonging and finding my voice in agriculture makes my journey more profound. I remember in 2008 when I went to California and saw 9 acres of field and said to myself, I got to be out there farming that field. And then for people to understand that when you have been oppressed for so many years, the trauma still exists. And that trauma did surface as I saw that field, and I said to myself, do I belong? And I found my sense of belonging when I said to myself, Karen, go to that field and put your hands in that soil. And when I put my hands in that soil, I felt the DNA, the microbials coming through my veins and giving my sense of belonging. And so it continues to be a journey of self-discovery. It continues to be a journey of belonging. But I just want to, just say that these principles that I have learned, I know so many other people out there have been going through the same thing. And now is a time whereby there's just a self-love that I have for myself and for my people. And also it's a way of people with power and privilege to start acknowledge the fact that this oppressive system has not been kind to the people who this country, the backward people of this country of enslaved and indigenous people have built on. And so I continue to learn, I continue to be outspoken, and I continue to be on a journey of self-discovery.
Wow. So the principles that guide our work are many, and we actually have an internal process where, our board and our staff, with feedback from our wider community, review our organizational values and visions and missions and calibrate. But to distill it, I would say there's maybe 3 underlying principles, right? One of them, which is overarching, is cultural biomimicry. If we don't know what to do as people, how are we looking to the earth for lessons, right? We look at the way the forest superorganism shares sugars, minerals, messages, warnings, resources amongst the trees, whether they are kin or non-kin, so that they can have their mast year together, so that they can warn each other about a pest outbreak, right? So how do we, in all things, really reflect upon taking lessons from the earth? So sacred biomimicry, hard work is a very important core principle of ours, and love. And I know love is kind of getting a bad rap these days. I was having this conversation with my mom. She was like, the movement today is really similar to what I was doing. My mom was very deep in the civil rights movement. She's like, except I don't really hear people talking about love as the basis of what we're trying to do. So I want to actually read a quote from Elder Ruby Sales about love, which grounds me. So she said, love is not antithetical to being outraged. Let's be very clear about that. And love is not antithetical to anger. There are 2 kinds of anger. There's redemptive anger and there's non-redemptive anger. And so redemptive anger is the anger that moves you to transformation and human upbuilding. Non-redemptive anger is the anger that white supremacy roots itself in. So we need to make a distinction. Some people think anger is a bad emotion, but it's where you begin the conversation. I became involved in the Southern Freedom Movement not merely because I was angry about injustice, but because I love justice and because I love my people. And that is where I began the conversation, not with I hate this, but with what I love. We need to begin a conversation that incorporates a vision of love with a vision of outrage. And I don't see these things as being over and against each other. You can't talk about injustice without talking about suffering. But the reason I want to have justice is because I love everybody in my heart. And if I didn't have that feeling, that sense, then there would be no struggle.
Thank you for that.
Beautiful. Thank you.
That love in action, and what does that look like? I think is something that is so much of, what our work should be, especially, as land tenders. And I say for me, I think it's interesting. I'm originally from Kansas City, Missouri. I am a Midwestern girl. My city, we throw parades for our cows. That is my background. I was a part of 4-H as, in elementary school. Like, I learned how to raise chicks and potbelly pigs, but I never quite saw that as, oh yeah, I should go into farming. I grew up in my grandfather's shop, which was in our city market, which Kansas City has this city market that's been around for, I guess, a couple hundred years or whatever. I got a chance to explore the seasons, to explore the farmer stalls, to, try like food truck food, like all of these different things. And in his shop, he wasn't a farmer. He brought together, like he would mix oils. He would actually go over to Africa and work with different workers to bring in shea butter. So before shea butter was in everything, as a kid, like I literally like learned to hate it / love it at the same time. Because it's, that original shea butter that's, you just gotta add something to it to make it smell nicer. And it's also there to where I learned to connect to community. So his shop became this place where folks from all over the African diaspora came together. So I would hear, French. I would hear all of these different languages coming from people who looked like me. And that was like this really beautiful experience of like connecting to culture. And my grandfather, he became an ancestor in August. So that is something that is like so deep for me, is, to go from that elder, to go from someone who taught me, so much the basis of the work that I do as an herbalist and as an entrepreneur, and being able to connect that to community and to this larger diaspora is something that I've held with me for over 30 years. And so that's part of like what guides my work. That and that curiosity, for folks who know who know what I've done or who've had a conversation with me, they're just like, how did you get from here to like here? And I'm like, there were some zigs and zags. And so sometimes I follow the zags, and I get excited about that. And it's, for me, it's also a place where I can find that renewal, and so many times find that connection, which is really interesting, is to find those connections between people, food, culture, ag, and how everybody comes together to enjoy one another and to enjoy the land. And I know we've talked about this, but if there are other like elders that you want to lift up right now, or also, because part of my background is also youth work, and so I've learned so many beautiful lessons by working with youth. If there are youth that you want to bring into the space and to share, we have over 1,600 people registered for this conference, and so if we want to find ways to lift those people up, this is a really beautiful time to do that.
Well, so many elders, both in the, realm of the earth and in the realm of Orun. But I am feeling in my heart right now, like I want to thank and uplift Mama Ira Wallace of Southern Exposure Seeds and Acorn Community. She is very dear to me. And I want to thank Ma Ira for being one of my seed keeping teachers. I was very intimidated by the idea of keeping seed, even though, I've done farming in various forms for well over 20 years. Seed saving felt like a mystery, like something that some other professional far away behind the seed catalog needed to do to provide me with. And she really counseled me to understand that we can't have our food sovereignty without our seed sovereignty, that we have a duty to the seed based on the legacy of our ancestors having braided that okra, cowpea, millet, agouti, black rice into their hair before being forced on a transatlantic slave ship, and that we needed to participate materially, right, in that seed legacy. So I'm a baby seed keeper. We only have a handful of seeds that we steward and that we share through the True Love catalog, and also in collaboration with the Mohican Nation, some of the seeds that they've entrusted to us to keep alive here in the homelands. But it really is a miracle. So I just did, for example, a germination test of the Plat d'Haïti tomato, which one of the seeds from my heritage as a Haitian person that we also distribute through the True Love catalog. So I did a little of my own germination test before I mailed the seeds off to Owen and Chris at True Love. You know, paper towel, you put like 20 seeds, you water it, you wait, and I'm waiting. And then after a few days, this little roots popped out and the green popped out. And I'm going around showing my children, like, this miracle, like these seeds came out this tomato. I did the fermentation thing, I did the drying thing, and they're like alive. They're alive. It's just amazing and so empowering. So thanks to Ira and all of the elders who have just been pushing us as the younger generation to not forget about the seed part of our food sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
This time last year, Thanksgiving, I was in California visiting my daughter and her family. And rather than go to Muir Woods, where I usually go, it's like a sacred space for me, around the redwoods, we went down to Great Basin State Park. And again, I got to convene with these mother redwoods, some that are 2,000 and a half years old. Some of the oldest, as we say, living beings on the earth. And I think about what wisdom they share. And I think about that the trees on our farm are, due to the fungi and the mycorrhizae, are all the way over there in California getting these messages because we lost a bunch of those trees this year in the fires there in Great Basin. So I think about those elders. I think about, in terms of youth, this summer here in my small town, or Richmond, Kentucky, one of my young cousins who just finished high school was leading, for her, the first time, was leading the Black Lives Matter protest marches here in our small town. I'm inspired by her and many other young folks around the country who have stepped up and provided leadership in these continuing struggles around police brutality and other forms of violence and oppression. But I'm also mindful of that I'm always inspired every day by my own ancestral elders who I'm still researching and discovering and finding how badass they were coming out of the years of enslavement, building community, great-grandmothers who were midwives and herbal healers and healing their community from the trauma post-Civil War. My great-great-grandfather who went to what's called Berea College in 1879, became friends with Carter G. Woodson, and he and other black farmers went on to invite to 5 miles from where I live at now, in a large kind of a gathering of black farmers and black teachers, the likes of W.B. Du Bois, George Washington Carver, Ida B. Wells. So I am still inspired within my own family. I'm wearing today my family reunion t-shirt, okay? This was our virtual reunion. I belong to 3 family reunions. My mom's side, my dad's side, my in-laws' side. I serve as the family historian, passed on to me by my mother and my great-grandfather, family griot. So I am just always, every day, lifting them up and remembering what an inspiration they were and have been in my life.
Thank you. I would sort of echo that. I just want to really uplift the unknowns, the nameless, the faces that continue to travel within my being through the wind, through the trees, through the earth. I don't have a way of tracking my heritage. I don't have a way of going to Ellis Island and looking at those books that so many people do have. And so I have to make sure each and every day that when I'm out there and I hear that wind blowing and feel that breeze, that it echoes the voices of my ancestors that are telling me, Karen, continue to do the work. Or when I'm with that tree and I hug that tree because I know the essence of that tree as its roots are connecting to one another, that they have seen the blood of my ancestors. They have heard the stories. And I hug them in response and respect for that. Each and every day, when I'm out in the field, there's a way that I try to speak to the universe. You know, it's my way of trying to do that call and response to so many people have paved the way for me to be who I am and to be where I am today. And that can never go unnoticed. That can never go unnoticed for our people, for our people. Because at the end of the day, we come from a lineage of people who traveled a long way to an unknown place, scared, loss of hope, loss of family. And out of that discovery, I came to be. And so, we talk about standing on the shoulders of greatness and kings and queens. Yes, that is true. That is true. But I want people to recognize that each and every day, if we just take the time to pause and listen to those voices and songs in the wind, that we know as a people that we have never been forgotten and that we will never forget those who have trailed the place before us.
That's beautiful. Thank you for calling those folks into the space. And, one of the folks I want to uplift who are, out here doing the work is, one of my sister farmer friends is Elsie Parks, who does work with Saffon as well as with the Black Agrarian Workers of the South Collective. She is one of those folks who reminds me of that the need for building culture and community is part of what Southern agriculture and agriculture should be, is that relational piece is so important, and is also somebody who reminds me of like my own power and ability to also use my healing for myself, and to take those practices that I've honed in my work and also be able to share that with myself in a deeper way. And so, I always want to lift up those young, like Southern farmers out there that don't always make it to these like huge national conferences and who are out doing that culture and agricultural building. And I also see my sister friend Keisha is in the chat too. Hey there. Her and High Hog Farm are doing amazing, beautiful fiber work. And so like just beautiful folks who are, doing that work of bridging culture and agriculture. Like you have to lift up those voices. And I also recognize that we are also starting to hit closer to time. But I'm loving this conversation, and I'm loving the gems that folks are being able to bring to this conversation. And I think a bigger thing is, I think we'd be remiss if we did not like acknowledge the moment that we're in right now, between COVID-19, a global pandemic, the push against police brutality and toward racial justice. How has that impacted your work? And also recognizing that for a lot of us, that because of the work that we're doing, and there's a lot of folks who were trying to support Black folks, and to, also there's some folks who are trying to get their woke shine on, that also like put a magnifying glass on the work a lot of us were doing. So how have you pulled that into your work and transformed it or rebelled against it, like whatever that looks like? I would love to hear your experience with this very much so unprecedented year.
I can say a few words to speak to that. I think we hopefully all know, both on this panel and folks listening, that anti-Black racism is not new to 2020, that police brutality, the carceral states, that racial capitalism is not new to 2020, that the industrial food system disproportionately negatively impacting Black, Indigenous, and communities of color is not new to 2020. I think what changed this year, and I'll try not to say it in a cynical way, but I think what changed is because the pandemic allowed people who had previously been insulated from the harms of empire to feel that pinch, to feel what is it like to have an empty grocery store shelf? What is it like to not be able to move about freely? What is it like to experience the state not having your best interests? I think for many folks who historically had experienced the privileges afforded in a white supremacist society, for the first time for some people said, oh my goodness, maybe it's not working. Therefore, it might be possible that the Black folks, the Indigenous folks, the Latinx communities, the Asian communities who've been saying for centuries, this is not working, maybe there's something to that. And they looked over and saw what we've been saying all along and became interested in aligning, some people with very open-hearted, very sincere aims to align and be in solidarity, and others for the performative aspect or the virtue signaling aspects. My hope is, though, that this heightened awareness and heightened attention, seeing that the industrial food system failed us, right? Seeing that the carceral state fails us, is not just a passing fad. And, I studied biology in my undergrad. I'm a science nerd. That's sort of where I'm coming from. And in the theory of evolution, there's a model called punctuated equilibrium versus gradualism. So essentially, if you look at the history of species and biodiversity with punctuated equilibrium, it's that there was a relative stasis and then a cataclysmic event and then an explosion of biodiversity and then relative stasis again till the next event. But you never go sort of back down to a less biodiverse world. You're always, and so my hope is, again, in the spirit of biomimicry, that it's not a passing fad, that we have this cataclysmic event, we're pushed to another level of consciousness as humanity, and that's where that becomes our base from which we build. And we've got to keep up that momentum. We've got to keep up the attention on the fact that there is no sustainable future, no global equity and justice without paying attention to these racial dynamics in all aspects, not just in the food system.
Yes. And I would add that we're also facing other pandemics. Yes to the pandemic of COVID-19, and yes to the pandemic of this continuation of what I call the killing fields in America, based around police brutality and other forms of violence, but also the pandemic of economic inequalities, which have increased in the last 30 or 40 years. The pandemic of ongoing environmental devastation and climate change. And they're kind of like all convoluting together in this moment. So in that sense, it's a revealing time, it's a pivotal time to ideally, hopefully, prayerfully, be a time for some type of leap, some type of a radical departure from where we are now that can be much more transformative. That's what is there as an opportunity, certainly. But I would want to go back just a moment to talk about this idea of whether we are all related to food and agriculture. You know, Wendell Berry says here, my friend here, longtime friend, and we disagree on some things and agree on others, but he says that eating is an agricultural act. And that means that we're all food activists. We're all part of the food movement. And fortunately, with the divine wisdom, every day we get to have an actual movement to move food through us and out, okay? And all around us, food connects us, okay? The clothing that we're wearing, the buildings we live in, this wooden desk on my table here, you know, the cars we drive, the books we read, these are all items that have the vibrations, if you will, of products from the land and from the sea. So the great remembering means to move away from this Newtonian Cartesian view of the world that gives us this idea of separations, to take a more quantum, a more indigenous, a more traditional look that these things are vibrating all around us, and that every part of the food system, if we say a prayer when we're eating as a sacred sacrament, then the production of food, the harvesting of food, the distribution of food, the retailing of food, and the disposal of food are all sacred practices. They're all spiritual practices. And that we're involved in all those things. You know, how we dispose of food, I have on the side of my house, compost bin, worm bins. I tell the kids that black soil is worm poop, and they laugh and they giggle, oh, worm poop, you know. But the idea that we should recognize that we are all involved in the food movement in a variety of ways doesn't require having to be on a farm to have these kinds of sacred relationships.
Wow. So I'm going to maybe talk in a different perspective, because even though I farm in rural settings, I am from the hood in the Bronx, in urban settings where, you know, where I've seen police brutality at its worst. And I think I want to sort of step back, because this started with the brutality of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in the very beginning, before this COVID has escalated. And when all of a sudden people realize, wait a second, wait, Black Lives Matter? You know, after like 400 years, Black Lives Matter? And so what has happened is that the concentration on racial injustice was co-opted. It was co-opted when people started really looking at the slogan, defund the police, defund the police. And so for me, when I heard that slogan, defund the police, for me, it really resonated, because for so long, a lot of us in urban settings have been saying that, have been saying defund the police. And for me, a lot of us have been working on transferring a lot of money that has gone into the police and putting it back into communities. And I say that because if you look at funding comes through asset forfeiture. And what that is that when every time you see on TV they're confiscating houses, money through drug activity, we have asked for so long that at least 10% of that money would go back into community-based organizations. And so for so long, when we were talking about defunding the police, in essence, that's what we were talking about, taking the money that for so long has impacted our community and place it into communities that need it the most, and not to go into the police department to become more military. And so again, now fast forward, COVID has come in, and so those same people who for so long had neglected our part in terms of racial inequality, all of a sudden now understanding that they too are on bread lines and food lines. And so now the conversation is even broader. And so what I'm trying to do, and so many of us are trying to do, is to see that there's an intersection between race, food, what's happening in terms of mass incarceration, police brutality, all is intertwined, and the effects of it is based on race. It's based on race, it's based on economics, and we must continue to have those hard conversations as we move forward. COVID has told us we are not going back. And so, what is this next iteration going to be? It has to be confronting racism, confronting wealth inequality, and confronting some of the problems that we have around land use. And so, our work needs to continue. It will continue. But at the end of the day, there needs to be a power shift and a power dynamic to make sure that at the end of the day, those who have been so long marginalized, that the power goes back into those communities.
Thank you for that. And I also want to call out, because at the beginning of the year, I was down in Brunswick living on the farm I'd been living on for the last 6 years. And not 10 minutes from that land is where Ahmaud Arbery was murdered in February. So, long before George Floyd, there was Ahmaud Arbery who was basically trapped like a deer and shot. And so, when I'm talking about how that impacts us being in the Deep South, of understanding that there is so many injustice, there's so much division, there's so much racism that has been left unchecked. And that part of that was understanding that the land that I was on was this refuge, this place that's been in African-American family for over 100 years. And so our space was that space to find that refuge and to find that connection to other Black farmers, as well as other people of color, Indigenous allies. And so for us was just understanding that, that connection, to that violence, hasn't gone away. And that there's so much that we need to do, there's so much that needs to happen within the system itself to either transform or tear down. But that even within ourselves, it's that understanding of healing that has to happen, that being in that trauma response of understanding that 10 minutes from where I stand, somebody was murdered, and many people think it's okay. Many people tried to cover it up. It took them so long to just arrest the people who did it, including the person who filmed it is the guy who worked at the hardware store that worked on our equipment. So we know these people. They're in our sphere. They're in our communities. And there is so much that we have to do, as Black folks, to navigate those spaces, to be able to hold ourselves, in our own safety and healing, but also be able to meet that head on a regular basis. And, combined with COVID, for me as a healer, so much of my work fell into helping community both near and far, so making herbal remedies, reishi tinctures, elderberry syrup, all the different ways in which people were trying to protect themselves as best as they could from a pandemic that we didn't know how hard, how long it would hit our communities. And for somebody who is on the coast, I think I stood back at the beginning, watching everybody face the empty shelves and the stockpiling of toilet paper and everything. And I was like, this is a hurricane by another name. Everybody in the nation and in the world are getting a feel for what it's like for us to be, in the path of a hurricane. The not knowing, is it going to hit? How hard is it going to hit? How long are we going to be without power, without food, without connection? And for those of us who are land-based, our animals going to be okay? Are our crops going to be okay? How are we going to be able to feed ourselves and feed our community? And so, it became this space of coming front and center as a healer and as a land steward, folks reaching out to us saying, are you going to have food? We don't, people thought there wasn't going to be enough food. That was the thought process when shelter in place started, was there's not going to be enough food. We're not going to be able to eat. And so very much so being in that space of like responding to community in very real and tangible ways with food and herbal medicine and suggestions. And so, are there other things in these last few minutes that you have honed for yourself, for your family, or for your community to bring that greater healing and transformation?
Well, as far as healing practices, I have to say that I think an important thing to keep in mind is that when we encourage or even admonish self-care to others, when community care is what's needed, that can perpetuate harm, right? And so really thinking about going back to the spirit of love, of solidarity, of full humanity, how do we hold one another? And asking ourselves, like, is this action that I'm taking, is this question that I'm raising, does this increase the labor for Black women, for Black trans folks? Or is this a way that we as a community are holding together the next steps that we need? So I think that is the big question that we're all asking ourselves in community right now, is expanding our self-care to community care. But I will say that for myself personally and for our family, we lean very deeply into our earth and ancestor-based reverence practices. We're practitioners of Vodun, practitioners of Ifa, and go to those powerful forces of goodness in the universe for our fortification, for our guidance, for our meditation, all of that. And that's that I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here if I didn't have that practice. So thank you for that.
Yes. I had the blessing back in the 70s to meet Baba Dick Gregory, who put his foot in my behind in a variety of ways. But he introduced me to the idea of fasting on a regular basis, which I try to do about 3 or 4 times a year. So when COVID hit, it came right about the time of my spring fasting and detox. So for about 2 weeks, I said, hey, I'm just gonna get on some water and try to build up my resistance and things like that. In addition, my mother, speaking about healing and trauma, my mother in 1954 lost her daughter, my sister, because of the Jim Crow practices here in Richmond, Kentucky. And my sister didn't get the proper help in the hospital. My mother had to return to this farm I'm living on now and spent several weeks healing what was back then called a nervous breakdown. But she was able to heal and to turn that trauma into her own activism, whereby a few years later she became the president of the Congress of Racial Equality. I got involved with the 10-year-old in the civil rights movement. So I guess I don't really know any better. I'm a believer in that one of the ways to healing is to do the kind of work individually, where you're taking a moment to kind of withdraw, introspection, with support from family and friends. But healing is also, for me, has meant be in the fray, be in the work of transforming our communities, our culture, our society, as a form of healing that's ongoing in that kind of process.
I'll make it short and sweet. People with power and privilege, you gotta speak up and you gotta speak out. I mean, that's it. We're not going back. You gotta speak up and speak out. So that's what I'm saying. And it's not get out the way.
Thank you for that closing note, Karen, and thank you everyone for sharing. Just absolutely beautiful, the amount of knowledge, care, grace, and love that you showed to this work. I continue to be in awe of, and I am just grateful to be in community with each and every one of you. So thank you for joining today, and thank you everyone else for listening in or watching on YouTube. And take care of yourself and take care of one another.
Love y'all. Love y'all.
Blessings.
Good work. Keep on keeping on.